It all started with a phone call. Oscar, Mr. Carter, his real estate investment manager, said enthusiastically, "I've found a property that matches your preferences. It's a colonial-style mansion in the exact area you wanted. It's been abandoned for a while, but it's a fantastic investment opportunity." Oscar leaned forward in his chair, intrigued. "Send me the details," he said. Moments later, the photos and documents landed in his inbox. Oscar opened the files, and as his eyes scanned the images, he paused in shock. "This house," he whispered to himself. It was the house, the mansion he had lived in as a child after losing his parents. The house where he had experienced both refuge and torment. Memories surged, the kindness of Henry, his father's boss, who had taken him in, and the cruelty of Margaret, Henry's wife, who had made his life unbearable. His emotions boiled over as he calls back his investment manager. "Carter, I need this house. Do whatever it takes to buy it," he said firmly. Carter was surprised by the urgency in Oscar's voice. "Understood. I'll get started immediately." Before Carter could hang up, Oscar added, "And find out who owns it now. I want to know what happened to the people who lived there before." Over the next few days, Oscar waited anxiously for updates. His mind was a storm of thoughts. What had happened to Henry? What had happened to Margaret and their family? He needed answers. Finally, Carter called back. "Oscar, the house is owned by a bank. It was foreclosed years ago." Oscar frowned. "What about the previous owners? What happened to them?" "The bank won't disclose that information." I pushed, but they refused to give me any details. Oscar gritted his teeth. "So, they're just going to sell it without explaining what happened?" "It seems so," Carter replied apologetically. "But they are ready to finalize the sale if you are." Oscar sighed deeply. The lack of answers frustrated him, but his determination to own the house outweighed his frustration. "Fine. Close the deal. I'll figure out the rest myself." When the purchase was complete, Oscar decided to visit the mansion himself. The whole process had been handled by his team, but he needed to see it with his own eyes. Driving up to the old iron gates, now rusted and overgrown with vines, he felt an unsettling mix of emotions. The house had aged, but it still held the grandeur he remembered. For Oscar, it wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of his painful past. As the millionaire stepped out of his sleek black car, the mansion loomed before him, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of time. The iron gates were rusted, the garden overgrown with weeds, and the once polished windows shattered and clouded with dirt. He paused at the front steps, his mind replaying the memories of a life he had worked so hard to escape. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The grand staircase, which had once gleamed with polish, was now covered in dust, its banister chipped and broken. Each step he took creaked loudly. Room by room, he walked through the mansion, each corner sparking a memory. The dining room, where he had eaten meals in silence, listening to the sharp criticisms of the lady of the house. The study, where he had secretly watched Clara's father pore over ledgers and business plans, absorbing every detail like a sponge. As he opened the door to what had once been a storage room, he froze. In the corner of the dimly lit space was a young woman, clutching a baby to her chest. Her clothes were tattered, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Oscar asked, his voice calm but firm. The girl pressed her back against the wall, her arms tightening around the baby. "Please, don't hurt us," she whispered, her voice trembling. It took him a moment, but then he saw it, the resemblance. Her features mirrored those of her father, the man who had once given him a home when he had nowhere to go. "Clara?" he asked, his voice softening in disbelief. She nodded slowly, her fear giving way to confusion. "How do you know my name?" The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a weak cry. The millionaire's eyes shifted to the child. The baby's cheeks were sunken, his tiny frame wrapped in a blanket too thin for the cold air. It was clear the child hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe weeks. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. Memories came flooding back. He was 5 years old, standing in this very house, clutching a small bag of his belongings after losing both his parents. Clara's father, a man with a kind smile and gentle words, had taken him in. He gave him food, a roof over his head, and, without realizing it, the foundation of the business knowledge that would later change his life. But the kindness had come at a price. The man's wife, Margaret, despised him, treating him like an unwelcome burden. She found every opportunity to belittle him, hurling cruel words and sometimes worse. He remembered one night vividly when Clara's father was away on his regular business trips. His wife, Margaret, had beaten him for accidentally spilling a drink. When her rage became too much to bear, he had packed a few belongings and slipped out into the freezing streets, leaving behind the house that had been both a sanctuary and a prison. And now, decades later, here he stood again, facing Clara, the daughter of the man who had saved him, and her baby, struggling to survive in the same house. The millionaire felt a wave of emotions: pity for the girl and her child, guilt for leaving without a word all those years ago, and a deep sense of responsibility. This was no longer just a house. It was a reminder of the past, a past that had shaped him into the man he was today. And now, it was a place where he could right some of the wrongs that had been done to him, and to the family who had once sheltered him. He took time to introduce himself to Clara. It wasn't difficult to recollect since she was a teenager when Oscar left the house. She was happy to see him but was heartbroken with the way her mother had treated him. Oscar, the millionaire, stood, staring at the frail woman before him. Clara's disheveled hair framed her pale face, and her arms tightened protectively around the baby in her lap. The infant, no more than 2-year-old, whimpered softly, drawing Oscar's gaze to his gaunt cheeks and threadbare blanket. "Clara," Oscar said gently, his voice breaking the silence. "You can't stay here. This place isn't safe for you or your baby." Clara's eyes darted nervously to the floor, her lips trembling as if she wanted to protest but didn't know how. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she whispered. Oscar, softening his tone, "You don't have to live like this. Let me help you. Please, come with me." After a long pause, Clara nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. Cradling her baby tightly, she followed Oscar out of the mansion, stepping into his sleek black car that felt worlds apart from the crumbling walls she had called home. Oscar's home was everything Clara's life had lacked: warm, spotless, and bustling with quiet efficiency as the staff quickly responded to his instructions. He directed them to prepare a guest room, complete with a crib for the baby, clean clothes, and hot meals. In the dining room, Clara sat stiffly at the long polished table, her baby nestled in her lap, now dressed in clean pajamas. The soft glow of the chandelier highlighted the exhaustion etched on her face. She kept her arms wrapped around her son, refusing to let go even as the staff offered to hold him. Oscar noticed the way she clung to her child, her fingers brushing the baby's tiny hands as if to reassure herself he was still there. Despite her own weariness, Clara's love for her baby was undeniable, a fierce and protective bond that spoke volumes. "You're safe now," Oscar said gently as he sat across from her. "Eat something. Rest. You both need it." Clara hesitated but eventually took a bite of the warm soup in front of her. It was the first proper meal she'd had in weeks. As the meal progressed, the tension in the room began to ease. Encouraged by Oscar's kind demeanor, Clara finally opened up. "My father passed away 7 years ago," she began, her voice trembling. "He was the glue that held everything together. After he was gone, things fell apart." Oscar listened intently, nodding for her to continue. "My mother, she wasn't the same after he died. She started seeing this man, Evan. He convinced her to take out a loan, said it was a once-in-a-lifetime investment. She trusted him." Clara's voice cracked, and she took a moment to steady herself. "It was a Ponzi scheme. Everything collapsed. The bank took the house, and we lost everything." Oscar leaned forward, his brows furrowed with concern. "What happened to your mother?" Clara hesitated, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She had a heart attack when the bank came to take the house. She couldn't handle the stress." Oscar's chest tightened as he imagined the weight Clara had been carrying. "After she died, I was on my own. I thought I had someone who cared, my son's father. But when he found out I was pregnant, he left. He said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility." Clara shook her head bitterly. "And you've been living in the mansion since then?" Oscar asked softly. Clara nodded. I thought I'd have more time before the bank sold it. I didn't know where else to go. I've been surviving on scraps, Anything I could find. Oscar leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Clara as she held her baby, close to her chest. Her voice trembled as she finished recounting the painful story of how her family had lost everything: her father's death, her mother's reckless decisions, and the cruel betrayal by a man who had only used her for money. As Clara spoke, Oscar's mind drifted back to his own past. He could almost see Henry, Clara's father, sitting at the grand desk in the study of that very house, patiently explaining the basics of running a business to a lonely, scared boy. Henry had always been kind. Despite the coldness of his wife, Margaret, and the torment she inflicted, Henry had taken Oscar under his wing. "Listen, boy," Henry used to say, tapping the edge of his notebook, "if you learn to manage money and treat people fairly, you'll always find a way to survive." Oscar had clung to those words like a lifeline, using the knowledge Henry shared to escape poverty after he ran away from the house all those years ago. Now, sitting across from Clara, he felt the weight of what Henry's kindness had meant to him, and what Clara had endured after losing her father. "I owe your father everything," Oscar said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "He gave me the tools to survive when I had nothing. And now, it's my turn to do the same for you." Clara's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and hope flickering across her face. Oscar continued, "You and your baby deserve more than this cycle of neglect and pain. You fought so hard to protect him, but it's time someone stood up for both of you." He leaned forward, his determination solidifying. "You won't have to struggle anymore. I'll make sure you have a safe place to stay, food, and whatever your baby needs to grow up healthy and happy." Clara hesitated, her lips trembling. "Why would you do this? After everything my family put you through?" Oscar gave her a faint smile. "Because your father believed in giving people a chance, even when it wasn't easy. And because your baby deserves to grow up knowing kindness, not just survival. This ends here, with me helping you build a future." Clara's grip on her baby tightened, her voice breaking. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Oscar nodded, already formulating a plan. This wasn't just about repaying a debt. It was about breaking the cycle of hardship that had consumed this family and ensuring that the baby grew up in a world filled with love and stability. He silently vowed that no one in that house would feel forgotten or abandoned again. As the weeks passed, Oscar, the millionaire, found his daily routine changing in ways he never imagined. His mornings, once filled with business calls and strategic planning, now started with the sound of baby Josh's tiny giggles echoing through the house. At first, Oscar felt unsure around the baby. He hadn't held a child since he was one himself. But Clara's gentle encouragement and Josh's curious, trusting eyes slowly melted away his hesitation. One morning, as Josh reached for his tie, babbling in his baby language, Oscar couldn't help but laugh. He began to notice the simple joys in Josh's small milestones. Whether it was the way Josh clumsily walked across the soft living room carpet, or the wide smile he gave when Oscar held him, every moment felt significant. It wasn't long before these small moments awakened something Oscar didn't know he had been missing: a sense of family. As the house transformed into a home, so did Oscar's outlook on life. For the first time in years, his wealth felt like more than a number in a bank account. It became a tool to build something meaningful. His mansion, once a symbol of his success, was now a place filled with laughter, warmth, and hope. As time passes, Oscar decided he wouldn't resell the property. Instead, he would restore it as a tribute to Clara's father, Henry, the man who had shown him kindness and taught him lessons that shaped his success. Oscar included Clara in the restoration project, encouraging her to take part in decisions and oversee certain aspects of the work. At first, Clara hesitated, uncertain of her abilities. She had spent so much of her recent life simply trying to survive. But as weeks turned into months, she began to flourish under Oscar's mentorship. With his encouragement, Clara found herself growing more confident. She learned how to manage budgets, negotiate with contractors, and make design choices that balanced beauty and practicality. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose beyond her survival. As Oscar worked alongside Clara, he began to realize that his involvement in the project wasn't just about honoring Henry's memory. Spending time with Clara and her baby, Josh, had awakened something deeper within him. He had spent his life chasing success, thinking that wealth would fill the emptiness left by his childhood struggles. But now, he saw that real fulfillment came from helping others. As the restoration continued, Oscar couldn't ignore the growing connection he felt toward Clara. Her resilience and warmth had broken through the walls he had built around himself. At the same time, he noticed the way Clara would smile when he praised her work or how her eyes lit up when they planned the next phase of the project together. Still, Oscar was cautious. He knew their bond was deepening, but he wasn't ready to rush into anything. One step at a time, he told himself. Clara, too, seemed unsure, though there were moments when her lingering glances suggested she felt something more. As the mansion began to take shape, Oscar reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Looking out at the mansion's newly restored facade, Oscar whispered, "Wealth is nothing without purpose. And purpose is nothing without people." As he and Clara stood side by side, watching the final touches being added to the house, he felt a quiet hope. Whatever lay ahead, he knew they were moving forward together, one step at a time.